For 14 years, Damien Cross believed he had already saved them. Every month he wired money home from Singapore. Every month the balance moved, and he told himself his parents were safe. He had paid for their retirement home. He had named his 110-foot yacht after his mother. He had rehearsed every word of the reunion he was sailing home to deliver. He had no idea his brother had been stealing every single cent. Damien Cross grew up on the floor of a tire garage on the Georgia coast, the youngest son of a family that repaired other people's vehicles because they could never afford one of their own. He left at 19 with nothing but ambition and a willingness to suffer for it. What he built across 17 years in Singapore was extraordinary. What was done to his parents while he was building it was worse. And the man responsible shared his last name. Cross Tire Garage had been a fixture on St. Simon's Island longer than most people could remember. Earl Cross had opened it in 1978 with second-hand equipment, a rented bay, and the kind of stubbornness that only men raised with nothing seemed to carry in their bones. He was not a wealthy man. He was not even a comfortable man. But he worked with his hands, and he paid his debts, and he raised 3 sons in the apartment above the garage, where the smell of motor oil came through the floorboards every morning, like a reminder of how the family stayed alive. Damien was the youngest of those 3 sons. He slept on a mattress beside the wall, and in winter, his mother May would fold an extra blanket over him because the space heater could not reach his corner. He did not complain. Complaining felt like ingratitude, and gratitude was the one currency his parents had always insisted on. Earl worked doubles most of his life. May kept the books, answered the phones, and raised boys in the spaces between. But Damien was watching. From the time he was 12 years old, he was watching the ships move through the Georgia coastal channels, heavy and slow, and headed somewhere that had nothing to do with tire rotations and brake pads. He read everything he could find about international freight, about trade routes, about the port cities where ordinary men had built extraordinary things by being willing to go further than anyone expected. At 19, he told his parents he was leaving for Singapore. His older brother Marcus stood in the doorway of the garage with his arms crossed, already the one who had stayed. Earl gripped Damien's shoulder and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Go build something that matters." May cried and then apologized for crying. Marcus said he would look after them. That sentence mattered more than anyone understood at the time. Damien arrived in Singapore with $1,200, a duffel bag, and a willingness to start at the very bottom. He scrubbed decks. He loaded containers. He studied logistics at night on a borrowed laptop in a room he shared with 4 other men. He made himself useful to people who noticed useful people. By 24, he had his first small brokerage contract. By 28, he had 3 employees and a reputation for delivering on time when the larger firms didn't bother. By 32, Damien Cross owned a partial stake in 2 container vessels and was being called into rooms where men in suits took him seriously. The shipping empire he built across 17 years was real, and it was earned. And every dollar of it carried the memory of that cold corner in Georgia, where a boy had watched ships and decided he would be on one someday. And every month, without exception, Damien wired money home to his brother Marcus with a simple instruction: for Mom and Dad. By the end of the 14 years, those transfers had totaled just over $93,000. He had also transferred a separate lump sum to cover the construction of a waterfront retirement home he had designed with his parents in mind. Wide porch, single floor, garden space for May, a workshop in the back for Earl. He had never once received a reason to doubt that any of it was being handled. Marcus answered his calls. Marcus sent brief updates. Mom's good, Dad's stubborn as ever. Don't worry, little brother, I've got it covered here. So when Damien Cross sailed up the Georgia coast aboard a 110-foot yacht he had named the May Ellen after his mother, he was not coming to rescue anyone. He was coming to celebrate. He was coming to place a deed on a kitchen table and watch his father's hands shake with pride. The taxi from the marina turned onto the street where he had grown up. Damien looked up at the house. A child's bicycle sat in the driveway. Curtains he did not recognize hung in the front window. A young woman he had never seen in his life looked up from her garden and shrugged when he asked who owned the property now. The Cross family had not lived here in years, she said. A neighbor from 3 houses down, old enough to remember Earl Cross fixing her car for half price in 1990, pulled Damien aside quietly. She pointed west, toward the industrial flats, toward the smell of burnt rubber and salt wind, toward a building that had been condemned twice and should not still be standing. Damien walked through the bay door of Cross Tire Garage and stopped. And what he saw there was something no amount of money, no number of ships, no 17 years of sacrifice had prepared him to survive. Earl Cross was asleep on a flattened cardboard box beneath a hydraulic lift that had not been used in years. His boots were still on his feet, which told Damien everything about how his father had learned to live in this place. A man who sleeps with his boots on is not resting. He is surviving. He is staying ready for something he cannot name. May lay on a narrow cot beside a portable space heater, a thin blanket pulled to her chin, her breathing slow and shallow in the way of someone who had long since stopped expecting the temperature to improve. The garage smelled of rubber and rust and cold concrete. A single extension cord ran from a socket near the bay door to a lamp, a hot plate, and the space heater. That cord was the entire electrical system for 2 people who had raised a family in this building and were now being stored inside it. Damien stood in the bay door for a long time before either of them stirred. When Earl opened his eyes and saw his youngest son standing in the gray afternoon light, he did not sit up quickly. His body would not allow quick anymore. He moved in stages, pushing himself onto one elbow, then upright, then slowly to his feet, each movement careful and deliberate. His face was thinner than the face Damien had carried in his memory. His hands, always the hands Damien measured everything against, the hands that had rebuilt engines and changed tires and gripped his son's shoulder at 19 and told him to go build something. Those hands were swollen at the knuckles. The fingers did not straighten completely, Dad, Damien said, and his voice broke on the single syllable. Earl looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked away. Not from shame, exactly, from the unbearable gap between what he had imagined this reunion would look like and what it actually was. May woke when she heard voices. She came to herself the way she always had, quickly, functionally, already reaching to smooth her hair before she had fully opened her eyes. When she recognized Damien, her face did something complicated. Joy and grief arrived at the same moment, and neither one fully won. "My boy," she said. Then she pulled the blanket up before he could see how thin she had become. Damien looked around the garage with the controlled expression of a man who had trained himself not to react until he understood what he was reacting to. There were 2 plastic storage bins in the corner that served as a dresser, a small cooler near the cot, a stack of prescription bottles on an upturned crate beside the space heater. He counted the bottles. Then he looked at the dates on the labels. Several of them were months out of refill. He knelt beside the crate and picked up one of the bottles. He had wired money specifically marked for his father's heart medication every month for 4 years. The bottle was nearly empty and 2 months expired. He set it down carefully and did not say what he was thinking. Instead, he asked the first question, the one he had been asking in his head since the moment the neighbor pointed him west. "What happened to the house?" May and Earl exchanged a look, the kind of look that passes between 2 people who have rehearsed this conversation many times without ever actually having it. Earl spoke first. "Marcus handled the money," he said. "There were complications." Damien nodded slowly. He opened his phone and pulled up his banking records. 14 years of transfers, each one marked with a memo, each one sent to Marcus Cross. He handed the phone to his father. Earl held it close to his face, squinting. His glasses were taped at the bridge. The amounts were all there, small in the beginning, larger as the years passed, totaling, across every transfer, just over $93,000, plus the separate construction transfer, plus the retirement account contributions he had been wiring into a joint account he and Marcus had set up specifically for his parents' future. "I sent all of this," Damien said. Every month. Did you ever receive it? The silence that followed was not the silence of people who did not understand the question. It was the silence of people who had been afraid to ask it themselves. Sometimes he brought cash, May said finally. Not much. He always said things were tight. He always said you were doing your best. He always said you were doing your best. Damien sat down on the concrete floor. He did not care about the cold or the grime. He sat because his legs had decided they were finished, pretending this was something he could stand through. For a moment, no one spoke. Earl turned the phone over in his swollen hands, reading the transfer amounts one by one, his mouth moving slightly as the numbers accumulated in his mind. When he finally looked up, his expression was not anger. It was something older and quieter, a man recognizing the shape of something he had refused to see for a very long time. We didn't want to ask, May said. Her voice was very small. Every time I thought about calling you, I told myself the same thing. You worked so hard to get out. I didn't want to pull you back. She reached across the cot and took Earl's hand. He let her. The tape glasses, the expired medication, the cardboard on the floor. None of it had made them call. They had protected Damien from the truth of their suffering because they loved him. And Marcus had known they would. He had built the entire arrangement on that knowledge. Damien asked to see the retirement account. May took a folded piece of paper from inside one of the storage bins. A bank statement, worn soft at the creases from being handled many times. The way people handle documents they keep returning to because they cannot believe what they say. She had been holding this statement for months. She had not called. The account balance was $4.17. Damien stared at the number. Then he looked at the transaction history. The withdrawals had started small, spread far enough apart to avoid any automatic flag. Then they accelerated. In the final 2 years, entire deposits had been pulled out within days of clearing. The account had been systematically emptied with the patience of someone who understood exactly how much attention the owner was likely to pay. The last withdrawal was dated 11 days ago. 11 days ago, while Damien was sailing up the coast with a deed in his bag and a yacht named after his mother, Marcus Cross had withdrawn the last meaningful sum from an account earmarked for 2 elderly people sleeping on cardboard in a condemned garage. Damien stood. He walked to the bay door and stood looking out at the industrial flats, at the salt grass and the low gray sky and the distant water. He had built ships for a living. He understood weight distribution. He understood how much pressure a structure could bear before it failed. He understood, in the mechanical language that had become his second nature, that what he was looking at here was a total structural collapse hidden behind a facade that had been carefully maintained for years. He turned back to his parents. He thought about every phone call with Marcus, every casual update, every time he had asked how they were doing and received an answer so easy, so smooth, so perfectly calibrated to relieve concern without offering any real information that it had never once made him suspicious. He pulled up Marcus's contact on his phone. Then he stopped. Because Damien Cross had spent 17 years making decisions that paid off because he made them in the right order. Anger wanted him to call right now. But something else, something colder and more precise, told him to go to the construction site first. If the retirement account was empty, if the family home had been sold, if his parents were living in a condemned garage, then the separate transfer he had made 3 years ago, the one marked specifically for the construction of his parents' retirement home, the largest single-wire transfer of his life, $130,000 sent in full, needed to be accounted for. He needed to see the land where that house was supposed to be standing. What he found when he got there was not an unfinished house. It was not a delayed project or a contractor dispute or a permit problem that had slowed things down. It was a parking lot, freshly paved, with a commercial sign already mounted at the entrance, the kind of sign that takes weeks to produce and install. The kind of sign that belongs to a business that has been operating long enough to need permanent signage. The name on the sign was not Cross. It was not any name Damien recognized. But the county property record He pulled on his phone in the parking lot, told him everything he needed to know about who had sold it. The county property record was precise and unsparing. Marcus Earl Cross had sold the parcel to a commercial development company 3 months ago for $275,000. The transaction had closed cleanly. The title had transferred without complication. There was no mention of the $130,000 Damien had wired specifically to build a house on that land. There was no notation explaining why two elderly people were sleeping on cardboard in a garage 4 miles away while the ground they should have retired on was being repaved for parking. Damien put his phone in his pocket and stood in the lot for a long time. The math arrived without invitation. $93,000 in monthly transfers across 14 years. $130,000 for the house that was never built. The retirement account, which had held close to $60,000 before Marcus emptied it in a pattern of withdrawals so deliberate they looked almost administrative. The total sitting somewhere above $280,000, not counting whatever Marcus had taken by other means. Not counting the family home. He drove back to the garage. May was sitting upright on the cot when he came through the bay door. She had put on her good cardigan, the blue one she reserved for occasions that required something better than daily life. She was trying to make the garage feel like a place where a visit could happen. That detail struck Damien harder than any number on a bank statement. He sat across from his parents on an upturned tire and asked them directly how they had lost the house. May pressed her lips together. Earl looked at his swollen hands. "It was 2 years ago," May said finally. "Marcus came with papers. He said it was estate planning. He said that when older people owned property in their own names, the government could claim it after they died to cover medical debts, nursing costs, things like that. He said if we transferred the house into his name as a trust, it would be protected for all 3 boys after we were gone." Earl asked him twice whether they would still be able to live there. Marcus said of course. He said nothing would change for them in their daily lives. He said it was just paperwork. 6 months after they signed, Marcus told them the property taxes had become unmanageable and that he needed to sell in order to cover the estate costs. He said the move would be temporary. He said he had found them a rental. The rental never happened. Those 4 words sat in the cold air of the garage like something solid. Damien's father, who had built a business with second-hand equipment and raw determination, had handed over the only significant asset his family owned because he trusted his eldest son. That trust had been used like a key. Damien asked about the garage, whether anything had been signed connected to the garage property itself. May went quiet. Then she stood slowly and retrieved a folder from the bottom of one of the plastic bins in the corner. Inside was a document Damien had not known to look for. A loan agreement. Earl Cross listed as borrower. $46,000 secured against the commercial property at the Cross Tire garage address. Damien looked at the signature line. Earl's name, signed 18 months ago. He asked his father whether he remembered signing it. Earl studied the document. Marcus said it was a refinancing, he said. He said it would reduce the interest on an old business loan I had let go too long. He brought someone with a notary seal. There was a great deal of paperwork. Damien turned to the final page. The lender was a private credit company, not a bank. The interest rate was high enough to be punishing. The loan had not been repaid. According to the default schedule printed in small type at the bottom, the garage was now 4 months behind, which meant the condemned building his parents were sleeping in was no longer securely theirs. A default judgment could remove them. They were one legal notice away from having nothing with a roof attached to it. Damien set the document on the concrete floor and did not speak for a moment. Then May reached into the pocket of her cardigan and showed him something small. A pawnshop receipt, folded at the crease and worn from being handled, the way people handle things they cannot throw away but cannot bear to look at directly. Marcus came in the spring, she said. He said he was in trouble with a contract. He asked if there was anything in the house that might help him while he sorted things out. He said he would return everything within the month. She unfolded the receipt. Your father's watch, she said, the one his own father gave him. And my cross. The gold one from our wedding day. Damien looked at the receipt. The pawn shop was across the causeway. The amounts listed for both items together were less than the cost of a single dinner on his yacht. A man's inheritance and a woman's 40 years of faith had been converted into an amount Marcus Cross would not have noticed missing from his wallet. Damien stepped outside. He needed the cold air before he could trust his own voice. He called the pawn shop from the parking lot. Both items were still in inventory. He gave his card number without asking the price twice. The man on the other end seemed briefly startled by how fast the transaction moved. Damien was not thinking about the money. He was thinking about the spring. About Marcus standing inside that garage, asking his mother for her gold cross, and walking back to his truck with it in his pocket. There had been a version of this story Damien had been quietly holding on to. A version where Marcus was desperate and reckless and had made decisions that spiraled beyond anything he had intended. He had kept that version available in his mind because he was a man who dealt in evidence, and evidence required a complete picture before a verdict. But desperate men steal from banks. They borrow from friends. They liquidate their own assets. Calculating men come back for their mother's jewelry. Damien got back in the car. He had the banking records. He had the loan document. He had the receipt May had pressed into his palm. He had the county land sale record. He had the wire transfer confirmation showing $130,000 sent 3 years ago to an account in Marcus Cross's name for a house that was never built. He had enough. Enough for an attorney. Enough for a civil case, and possibly enough for something considerably more serious than that. The attorney would wait 1 hour. His brother's address took 40 seconds to find through a public property search. Marcus Cross had purchased a home on the north end of the island 18 months ago, not long after the family house had sold. A quiet subdivision. A maintained yard. A new truck in the driveway and flower beds that someone had tended recently. Damien sat outside for a moment and looked at the house. Then he walked to the front door and knocked. What happened in the next 30 minutes would either become the conversation that unraveled everything quietly, or it would become the moment Damien Cross understood, with absolute and permanent clarity, exactly what his brother had always been, beneath the calm voice and the easy reassurances. The door opened. Marcus Cross looked at his youngest brother standing on the front step and did something Damien had not prepared himself for. He smiled. Not the smile of a man caught. The smile of a man who had decided, sometime between the first theft and this moment, that confidence was the same thing as innocence. And that was when Damien understood that the hardest part was not yet behind him. Damien did not go inside. He stood on the step and let the silence do the first work. Marcus filled it the way he always had, with words. He said it was good to see him. He said he had heard Damien was doing well. He said he had been meaning to call. He was using the voice of a man who had rehearsed a version of this conversation and believed that version would hold. Damien let him talk. He had learned, across 17 years in rooms where money and power moved, that a man who believes he is controlling a conversation will eventually hand you the evidence you need to end it. When Marcus finally paused, Damien said one sentence. He said he had been to the garage. The smile did not vanish immediately. It changed. Something behind it recalibrated. Marcus said their parents were getting older and had made some decisions that were difficult to manage from a distance. He said he had done everything he could with the resources available. He said family finances were complicated. Damien held up the pawn shop receipt. He said nothing. Marcus looked at the receipt. Then he looked past Damien toward the driveway, a brief involuntary calculation, and then back. He said that was a private loan arrangement that May had offered, that he had fully intended to redeem both items. Damien held up the retirement account statement, the balance of $4.17. Marcus's jaw tightened for the first time. He said there had been unexpected costs. Medical expenses, property management fees. He said these things were not simple. Damien held up the county property records showing the sale of the land where his parents' retirement home should have been standing. Marcus said nothing. Damien told him he had an appointment with an attorney in 45 minutes. He told him the banking records showing 14 years of transfers, all made out to Marcus Cross with memos specifying they were for their parents, had already been documented. He told him the loan agreement their father had signed, the one that had put a lien against the last property the family owned, was in the folder. He told him a handwriting analyst would review the signatures on the property transfer documents because some of them did not look like their father's hand. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice once since arriving on the island. He had learned that a steady voice unsettles a certain kind of man far more than anger does, because anger gives a liar something to perform against. Stillness gives him nothing. Marcus made one more attempt. He said Damien did not understand the full picture. He said there were debts attached to the garage their father had accumulated over years. He said he had been managing a situation that Damien, from his position overseas, had never been equipped to see clearly. He said a lot of money had gone into keeping things from getting worse. Damien told him he was welcome to present that accounting to the attorney. Then he turned and walked back to his car. The attorney's name was Patricia Holloway, and she had been practicing elder financial abuse law in coastal Georgia for 19 years. She did not express shock when Damien spread the documents across her conference table because very little shocked her anymore. What she expressed was a kind of focused recognition. She had seen variations of this architecture before. The gradual property transfer justified as estate planning. The retirement account accessed through a shared signatory arrangement that the elderly holder had not fully understood. The private loan secured against a commercial property. The disappearing construction fund. Each piece individually might be explained. Together, they described something deliberate. She filed an emergency motion to freeze any further transactions connected to the garage property and the remaining cross-family accounts. She submitted a formal complaint to the Georgia Office of the Attorney General under the Elder Financial Exploitation Statute. She contacted the county recorder's office regarding the land transfer documentation and requested a review of the title chain. And she made one additional call to a contact at the county sheriff's department. Because two of the signatures on the property documents were, in the opinion of a document examiner she retained the following morning, inconsistent with Earl Cross's known handwriting samples. Marcus Cross was interviewed by investigators 8 days after Damien knocked on his door. He hired an attorney of his own. He offered explanations that became less coherent each time they were examined against the paper record. Within 3 weeks, the sale of the retirement home parcel was placed under civil challenge. The proceeds from that sale, still largely intact in an account Marcus had not yet fully accessed, became subject to a restraining order. What followed over the next several months was not a dramatic courtroom battle. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to watch. It was the legal dismantling of a brother's version of himself. Every document Marcus had produced, every explanation he had given their parents, every casual update he had sent to Damien, reassembled in conference rooms and depositions and formal filings until the architecture of the theft was completely visible. The civil case settled before trial. The terms required Marcus to return the net proceeds from the land sale, repay the retirement account withdrawals with interest, and satisfy the private loan that had been placed against the garage property. The total restitution figure came to just over $310,000. He sold his house on the north end of the island to cover most of it. Damien did not feel what he had expected to feel when the settlement was finalized. He had expected something like relief, or satisfaction, or the particular clean sensation of a problem solved. What he felt was much more complicated, the way you feel when you win something back that should never have been taken, because winning it back cannot return the years attached to it. The final surprising detail arrived not from a document or a legal record, but from May herself, 2 weeks after the settlement closed. She was sitting in the kitchen of the waterfront house Damien had rented for his parents while he arranged something more permanent. Earl was in the next room, watching television with his glasses repaired properly for the first time in years, the gold watch back on his wrist. May told Damien that the blue cardigan she had been wearing the day he walked into the garage, the good one she had put on to make a condemned building feel like a place a visit could happen, she had bought it herself 8 years ago with $30 she had hidden in a coffee tin above the stove. She had never spent money on herself without her son's knowledge. But she had seen that cardigan in a thrift store window and thought it was the color of the ocean on a good day and bought it because she wanted one thing in her life that was only hers. She said she used to wear it on the days she felt the most afraid. It made her feel like someone who was managing. Damien looked at his mother in her good blue cardigan, in a warm kitchen, with her husband's voice coming through the wall, and understood that the hardest thing about what Marcus had done was not the money. The money could be recovered. It had been recovered. What could not be fully recovered was every morning his mother had reached for that cardigan, because she needed the courage to survive a day that should never have required that much courage to begin with. That understanding was the weight Damien Cross carried off the island. And it was the reason that when people asked him later what the experience had taught him, he did not talk about legal strategy or financial vigilance or the importance of monitoring wire transfers. He talked about his mother's coffee tin, about the $30 she had kept for herself, about what it means to love someone so carefully, so completely, that you will suffer in silence rather than risk interrupting the life you sacrificed everything to give them. And he said that the greatest failure of his own love had been believing that sending money was the same thing as being present. It was not the same thing. It had never been the same thing, and his parents had deserved both. There is a particular kind of theft that never appears on a bank statement. It is the theft of time. Of the years a person should have spent feeling safe and instead spent surviving. Of the mornings that required more courage than mornings should require. Marcus Cross stole money, and the law addressed that. But no settlement document, no matter how precisely written, could return a single one of those mornings to Earl and May Cross. That is the part of these stories that tends to get lost in the accounting. We focus on the numbers because numbers can be proven, recovered, ordered, returned by a judge. We focus on the betrayal because betrayal has a name attached to it, and naming things gives us a feeling of control. But the quieter damage, the damage that lives in a folded pawn shop receipt, in a blue cardigan worn for courage, in an old man's boots left on because he has learned not to fully rest, that damage does not get a settlement figure. It gets carried. What Damien Cross understood, standing in that warm kitchen with his father's voice coming through the wall, was something most of us resist understanding until we are standing somewhere similar. That love expressed only at a distance, only through transactions, only through the belief that provision and presence are interchangeable, is love that can be intercepted. It can be redirected. It can be used against the very people it was meant to protect. The people in your life who would never ask you to come back are sometimes the exact people you need to go back for. Not because they are failing, because they are still, after everything, trying to protect you. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us what it made you think about. And if you believe the people who gave you everything deserve to know you are still paying attention, subscribe. We tell these stories because they matter, and so do the people inside them.